that? Why does he keep coming back to the word now, now, now? Of course, the idea here is we don't have time to wait. We've been waiting. We've been waiting for 100 years, and the waiting is over. There seems to be, jot this down in your notes, there seems to be a suggestion standing behind this now word to his white audience of especially those in governmental power. If you don't hurry up and do something now, we cannot predict very well, other than violence, what's coming. In other words, the time has come when people are no longer going to allow for this kind of thing to continue, right? We continue, then he makes the observation that a rude awakening is happening in this nation if it returns to business as usual. And then he gets his second major applause, right? And then he says it. I would say to my own people, and this is again a conceding of a point of a kind, to my own people, that while we go forward, we cannot drink from the cup of bitterness and hatred, the top of 545. Rather, dignity and discipline. Hey, put this in your notes. Notice all the words that King likes to use that will have the same letter sound at the beginning of them. Dignity and discipline. The repetition of certain sounds that, again, as a speaker, starts to make this speech, as one of my students once said, this speech increasingly starts to sound more like a poem or even a song. And for my rap artist lovers in the house, they recognize in this speech that there's a certain kind of rhythm that starts to be produced in this speech, which starts to kind of remind them of really solid rap lyrics that have been written. Very similar kind of thing, right? Notice he says it though. Not all white people are bad. This is huge, right? He calls it physical force with soul force. And then he compliments those of his white brothers and sisters who are actually right there in the actual audience of the speech. When you watch this speech, you will see that the camera pans away and will show that there's both white as well as black listeners in the audience. So in other words, he's making an important point. Think about the power of having 1 million people. I've said this before to my freshmen. They're like, wow, I hadn't thought about this. Think about the power that Martin Luther King Jr. has when he has 1 million people out in front of him. The majority of them are black. He could have leaned into the microphone and said, it's over. Go out and find every white person you can find and kill them. He could have done this. He had the power to do it. In that moment, with all of that energy, King had the power to basically say anything into that mic he wanted to say, and he didn't say it. Instead, he decided he would use soul force instead of physical force. Let's put it in our notes. King lived the very message that he was speaking. That makes him authentic. That makes him real to both his black as well as white listeners. And he makes the observation, we cannot walk alone. Now this is the unifying element of the speech, and notice the repetition of the we again and again. We cannot turn back. We can never be satisfied. We can never be satisfied. We can never be satisfied. Notice the power of the word we, and let's jot it down already at 3A. What is that we? Well, it's a hearkening back to the most famous we in American political writing. What is that we of American political writing? Of course you know it. From the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? In other words, this is the unifying, this is the togetherness part of the speech, right? And then he continues on page 545, third paragraph, I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. 2 times in this speech, right? Jot it in your notes. And again, guys, I'm only touching the epidermis of this speech. You can go back and study this speech in far greater detail, but watch word choice. 2 times he mentions police brutality. 2 times. Why? Because the police, of course, represent the power of the government. And 2 different times he mentions the fact of the brutality of the police and why that's such an important icon. If the police are not giving proper due justice, then nothing else can ever be appreciated, right? 2 times he uses the notion of the staggered by the winds of police brutality, right? And then he calls it creative suffering. Now let's put this in our notes. This is a famous idea. It's not invented by King. It's of course a very ancient idea, and it runs something like this. Why does bad stuff happen to good people? It's what we will call later in your studies the theodicy question. Theodicy. The theodicy question. Why does bad stuff happen to good people? The answer for King is that you must use suffering in a creative way to find some way to evolve or grow. A way, we've said this in 303, is when bad stuff happens, no longer ask, why is this happening to me? But rather learn to ask, why is this happening for me? When you change that preposition from 2 to 4, right? You are then no longer considering yourself a victim in a world where all this stuff happens. Stupid school, why do they always do stuff to me? No. This is the wrong view. And King will argue this in his creative suffering argument. That in fact, when bad stuff happens, you have to ask, why is this happening for me? How can I learn from this? Hey, please understand. He is not advocating that, hurrah, we're always happy when bad stuff happens. No. But when bad stuff happens, we have to find a way to not see ourselves as simply the victim, but rather we have to see ourselves as somehow capable of learning through a negative experience. He'll call it creative suffering. And then he says it. Go back to Alabama, go back to Mississippi, go back to Georgia. In other words, he says it. There's a reason why you're here. Notice the speech then does 2 brilliant things. Let's write it down. 1, the speech will qualify the current problem. No question. We got a bad check. We are in a bad situation right now. We have no justice. But if he had left it at that without a solution, then all of a sudden we got problems in this speech. But notice his second. If the first part of the speech is backward looking, the second part of the speech is forward looking. The hope part of the speech. And so he says it, go back. And then he says it. I still, last line, right? Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. What a great line. I've even had students that write that line down and stick it up on a wall or in their locker because they know in their freshman year they're going to hit some stuff that makes them really sad. They're going to have some stuff at home. They're going to have some stuff in their neighborhood. They're going to have some stuff in their school that's going to make them feel like they are so sad. They're ready to quit and give up. The valley of despair. He says it. Let us, in terms of the valley of despair, he says, let us not wallow in the valley of despair. Notice the repetition of the L sounds with the words wallow and valley. Do you see it? In other words, for those of you who are interested in writing poetry or even rap lyrics, why is it that all of a sudden this speech starts to sound increasingly like poetry or rap? Notice the repetition of the L sounds. It's a powerful moment. Though, let us not wallow in the valley of despair. And then he says it for the first time. I still have a dream. And with that, he then will begin to inject into this speech this notion of the dream. And then he repeats it. A dream rooted in the American dream. Now, in your junior year, write this down at 3A. We're going to meet F. Scott Fitzgerald and his critique of the American dream in the classic novel, The Great Gatsby. For those of you that are all familiar with the novel, The Great Gatsby, that is a critique of the American dream. And what is the American dream? It is the idea that economically, one can come to this country and can do anything he or she wants if one works hard enough. That's the American dream. Now, there's always been a debate about whether it's legit or if is it a myth. In other words, when you use the word dream, we're really saying it's a mythology and it's not true. But notice, for King, he will root everything now that he says. And 8 times, you can count it up now, 8 times he will repeat, I have a dream. Jot down in your notes. That's the what is it. That's called repetition, parallelism. Why though? How does it work? What is significant about saying it over and over again? I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream. What's significant about that? Jot down in your notes. Many have pointed out that it's like a mantra or a gong that keeps coming back over and over again. In other words, it's hopeful, it's futuristic looking, and notice, profound. It is not, hey, watch this subtle. This is subtle. It's not that he says, we have a dream. Write down in your notes that important observation. It's not that he says, we have a dream. We have a dream. We have a dream. It's rather, I have a dream. I have a dream. Jot down in your notes, what's significant about that? That you have Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial to 1 million people, and he doesn't say, we have a dream. We have a dream. He says, I have a dream. I have a dream. What's significant about that in terms of the rhetorical content? Well, many have pointed out the power is when King uses this mantra over and over again, he reaches out and he invites every single person to share in the use of the pronoun I. And when you put a bunch of I's together, you get a we. You get a collection. You get a unity, if you will. Let's play the game now of the unity. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He talks about the sweltering of Mississippi, that oppression. It was hot the day, by the way, that King gave this speech. It was really hot. And so there was already some feeling of anger and concern about all these people packed in so tightly together on the mall there. Notice, I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, and of course when he says this, one day down in Alabama, that repetition of that D word starts to give this speech that melodic quality. I've had students that say, it's such a compelling and emotional speech, but why? We're looking at the why now. See, we're dissecting now at a close level why some of this happens, right? And then finally, he uses valleys again. Only notice, it isn't just the valley of despair. He cites from the Bible itself, Isaiah 40, 4 through 5, this idea of all that every valley shall be exalted and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plains, the crooked places made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. That is to say, he is referencing a biblical allusion here as well, one that is always going to resonate with his audience. Then he says it, this is our hope. Note the genius of this speech. He goes from, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream, to, this is our hope. It's as if he, watch this. It's as if he reaches out and he grabs all those people in the audience, and by extension, obviously, readers of this speech long afterwards, and he says, this is what I believe, follow me. This is, of course, what great leaders do, right? They state their position, but in stating their position, they reach out and they say to everyone else, come with me. This is our hope, he says. This is the faith. Wait a minute. What are the three Christian charities? Faith, hope, and love. He's mentioned all three of them in this speech, and that's compelling, right? That's compelling. Faith, hope, and love. Now, when we get in your junior year to study Letter from a Birmingham Jail, we're going to have Martin Luther King in his most famous letter writing to his fellow preachers, ministers, who are white and are telling King, you need to knock it off with all of this disruption of our society. And it will be King who comes back to this notion of faith, hope, and love in that speech as well. And then, of course, a powerful word picture. The jangling discords of our nation will become a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Again, this together, right? This faith, he says, that we will work together. All of God's children will be able to sing. And then, of course, he quotes it, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. And then on page 548, notice the mantra of the word ring. Over and over again. Ring, ring, ring. Of course, let's point out that this is what bells do. And what's the most famous bell in American history? Well, it is the Liberty Bell, of course, of Philadelphia. In other words, King is doing something here. He's playing with American history. He's playing with the ride of Paul Revere. He's playing with the understanding that a bell rings and then that sound resonates, ripples right out, and he will say it. Notice he likes the curvatures, slopes of California. We're back to the sea sounds along with Colorado. And then, of course, not only is it out west, not only is it up north, but he calls, of course, for this freedom to ring in the south, where, of course, all kinds of terrible things are happening in terms of racism. All of God's children, black, notice his pairing. Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics. And then, of course, he finishes by quoting the old Negro spiritual, a religious song, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Not I am free, but we are free. All right, let's jump to 2 and 3 levels of reading really quickly to finish our study here before we move to our viewing of this amazing text. At 2a, what for you is the most compelling message here? Many have pointed out that it's brilliant, that this is a speech which really does bring to draw everyone together. It's all about unity. It's all about being together. It's all about arguing that in the end there aren't lots and lots of different Americas. There's only one America, and that is the America of all of us working together to make one, right? A second major message or theme is, of course, this notion of what we sometimes will refer to as out of that valley of despair, creative suffering. The notion that pain is a propedeutic. Propedeutic meaning instructional. It's didactic. It helps us. It helps us to get through stuff. Right? We could ask at 3B, what's the last time you had something terrible happen in your life? But you look back and you say, you know what? I think it was actually good for me. It was actually important for me to have that experience. Finally, number 3 at 2A, a primary message and theme is that we have to dream. We have to dream. When we no longer dream, when we no longer believe that the future can be better than the present, when we no longer believe that the past can be somehow corrected or fixed, when we stop believing that, Dream says, we stop living. He will say elsewhere in his life, there are lots and lots of people who are dead. They're just waiting to stop breathing to prove to us what we've known about them long ago. He also said, if you don't have something worth dying for, you don't have anything worth living for. Which is a compelling observation, given, of course, that King himself made the ultimate sacrifice. He knew that there were lots and lots of racist people who hated what he was saying because he was trying to bring people together. Of course, at 2B, we've already pointed out a number of rhetorical techniques. What is for you, watch this, what is for you your favorite line of this text and why? And then ask about it at the rhetorical level. The rhetorical level, in other words, the way it works, the powerful metaphors. What are for you the most powerful metaphors? I once had a freshman student and she loved music. And so she loved the metaphor of taking those chords that are not fit together, they're disharmonious. Like if you pick up a guitar and you strum it and somebody goes, whoa, whoa, that guitar needs to be tuned. What's up? Well, the chords are not harmonious. You tune those chords and you strum it and you get that beautiful kind of symphonic sound. What is your favorite word picture? What is your favorite repetition? Notice this is I almost called it a poem. This is a speech that has those repetitions, that parallelism over and over again for an effect. And what is that effect? Of course, people are listening. Hey, this is significant. Think about this. You just read the speech, and now we're working through it, looking at the words. The people who were there didn't have a script. So they could only listen, right? And it's natural, you know this because of monkey mind, yes? It's natural to start out listening and then your mind starts wandering. And you hear something and then you kind of go, oh yeah, that reminds me of a thing. And so watch this in your notes at 2B. All of those repetitions bring the attention of the audience back to his point one more time. Notice free at last, free at last, free at last is the way the speech ends. And of course, he's standing in front of the Lincoln Monument, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address will end with a country, a nation of the people, by the people, for the people. That repetition of threes is what we call our trinities, right? The threes. And this takes us all the way back to our studies of St. Augustine and the power of that idea that those threes and our study of Francis Bacon. You're going to see this later in your high school career. I'm kind of setting you up for it. Let's talk now 3A. What is for you the most profound movie that you have ever seen that challenges people who have racist views to lay that racism down and come together? What's that for you? The most compelling movie. How about this? What's your favorite song that says we've all got to figure out a way to live on the planet together? Because you have a certain skin color, I have a different skin color, and somehow you and I can't get along. It's insane. It's a crazy way to see the world. What is your favorite song? Do you play a video game that teaches this as well? The power of being together, the power of being united. For example, maybe in your video game, you can't win the game alone. You got to go out and get somebody else to help you, and that somebody else helping you is the only way that it will be accomplished. From 1, we go to 2. From I, we go to we. What's your favorite game that seems to kind of suggest that? All right, let's go to 3B. let's ask at least a couple of questions here. The first question is about the speech itself. What is for you your most compelling moment in this speech? What is for you the moment when you were watching, or listening, reading the speech, and you kind of sat up and you went, whoa, that's an interesting idea, that's a compelling idea. Of course, we will say this out loud. We are studying this in the year 2018. Obviously, this speech is a few years old. 100 years, the speech, 100 years, he starts out the speech right. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's finish now with this last, and I think they are disturbing questions, but this speech is a disturbing speech, so let's ask the disturbing questions. Why is America still struggling with the challenges of racism? Why? I mean, it's so many years since the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the American Civil War, the speech given by Dr. King. Why is it still the case in America that we struggle so much with the idea that a person is defined by the way they look, their skin color, the things that are, instead of the content of their character? In other words, who they are. Why is it still a struggle? And do you think that there will ever be a chance that you could live in a country where that doesn't occur? By the way, notice, King will argue it happens with the children. When the children are able to finally grow up together and to be educated together in classrooms, they will increasingly be less and less interested in seeing other people for their skin color or their money or their religious views or whatever. The challenge, of course, is an individual challenge. What can you do today to begin to be less divisive, less seeing the other person as the other? The challenge, of course, is right there in the lines of the Bhagavad Gita that the great American writer Henry David Thoreau was so interested in, to see oneself in all being, and all being in oneself. What a challenging idea. Well, there you go, an introduction.